economics of our world help structure our aesthetic consumption and production. And today we talk about work done over the summer with my wonderful team of Danny, Carolee, Tony, and my PI, Melanie. Um, so let's hop into it. Sec. Okay. We're just talking a bit about the motivations behind our work. Um, as Naomi just said, digital humanities work isn't just applying STEM methods to the humanities. It can be more than that. It's also the goals of digital humanities research isn't necessarily the same as the goals of data science research. It's also not necessarily the same as the goals of humanities research. Um, there's a lot of different ways to study literature. In English departments, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with close reading as kind of like a foundational method of how we engage with text. And that comes from a specific school of literary criticism called New Criticism, which focuses on the unity of the text and the formal coherence of a text. There are other ways to study literature. There's historicist methods that focus on how what's in a text corresponds to historical context surrounding it. One way that I think digital humanities can really leverage itself in the world of literature is through the kind of paradigm of literary analysis called reader response criticism. In other words, the meaning of text comes not just from what's in the text, but how it's taken up empirically, how readers actually engage with it, and how these texts kind of circulate in the world. In our world, we purchase books or we check them out from libraries. There are costs associated with printing them. Authors make money off of them through royalties. Publishers buy advances for books. Readers spend small amounts of money to consume them and then put them up on their bookshelf. Books, even the most literary of them, function as commodities. So kind of a primary guiding question for us was how do we kind of study literature as a commodity? How can we track how it circulates and how can we track how it moves through a global marketplace? So why is this kind of hard? The main reason this is hard is because book sales are proprietary and inaccessible. But there's one kind of primary vendor of sales data, and that's it's Nielsen, the kind of mega conglomerate. And they have this kind of subsidiary called BookScan. And they own all the book sales data, and they don't give it to academics. The only people who have access to it are publishers. And this is not great, right? Book sales matter in the real world. They end up shaping decisions that publishers make around which books get accepted, which books don't get accepted, which books eventually hit our shelves. And because of this kind of inability for us to access sales data, it makes it really hard for literary scholars to understand the axes of popularity, the variable of popularity, and how that relates to the content of our books. So what have literary scholars done in the past to kind of get at popularity? One example here is Goodreads ratings. So number of ratings on Goodreads is a kind of useful proxy for how popular a book is. There's some problems with that, obviously, right? Like it's a very online segment of the reading population that's going to be posted on Goodreads. And two, it's a snapshot. It's a moment in time. You have you don't have temporal granularity when you look at the Goodreads page. Another kind of common source of information about popularity are bestseller lists. And these are great, but in the end, bestseller lists are about a finite number of books, the most popular ones. They're ranked, so you don't get a sense of the scale of the difference in popularity between some of these books. And their methodologies are kind of black boxy and obscure. Bestsellers aren't necessarily the books that just get the most sales any given week. There's complex algorithms that kind of feed into it. Which bookstores are they getting data from? Which bookstores are not getting data from? What goes into it? What doesn't? There's a lot of research on that online, but these are imperfect measurements is the point I'm trying to make. So the data source that we kind of turn to is the Seattle Public Library Open Checkout data. And this is a major free data source located here in Seattle. And our group has actually written about this data source as a tool and as a proxy for national book sales. And you can read more about that in that article we referenced at the top. And library checks are obviously not the same thing as book sales, right? It's especially not library checkouts from a city like Seattle. The idea is that hopefully we can kind of use it as a way to kind of gauge the types of events, the types of things that are shaping popularity and shaping the way these books are circulating. Book checkouts are granular. They're temporally detailed, right? So these are both advantages we have over Goodreads ratings and bestseller lists. So great, we've got a good data source to talk about books and how books kind of move over time as commodities. Um, we can do so many cool things now. We can compare genres. We can compare all the books, see what's most read. We can look at different life cycles of books. We can look at how books decay after their release date. There's tons of options. The issue is, uh, it's hard to actually get from library checkout data um, easy numbers that represent how a book is doing. That's because of the issue of persistent book identifiers and book reconciliation. Let's see if I'm showing up. There we go. Um, Book reconciliation is hard. Here on the left side of the screen or the right side, we've got 8 different titles for the same book in the data. There is no ID out there that lets us reconcile all these. We have to find these ourselves and then map these to the same title, right? This is really hard to do at scale. This is just one book. We can do this for one book. We can do this for a finite subset of books. We can't do this for all the books. So a lot of work with public library checkout data, this isn't just public library checkout data. This is issues with persistent book identifiers are a problem across any type of kind of book data source you look at. And this is kind of an ongoing problem that a lot of researchers are looking to solve. And there are a lot of different kind of bibliographic methods that are being developed to kind of get at this. But the kind of bottom line is that there's a lot of manual work that goes into labeling the data and setting up the data in a way that we can actually perform cool analyses with. So what did we do? We had to look at a finite subset of the books. We ended up choosing to look at the Norton Anthology Volume E, which represents authors who've written from 1945 to the present. This represents 93 distinct authors and 1,600 unique works that are kind of featured associated with these authors in the Norton Anthology. And this was kind of the core of our time over the summer. The big team of 5 of us spent a long time looking through all these authors on the SPL and making sure we had them all. But I guess maybe to back up a bit, what is the Norton Anthology for those who don't know? It's this very kind of important, powerful institution in the literary world that confers prestige towards authors. Being canonized means being anthologized. And that's important. It's an example of a kind of institution, the way like museums confer prestige on artists. That's what a literary anthology, the Norton Anthology, does. It shapes curricula. It shapes what gets taught in courses, and it gets shaped to what kind of emerges and stays in the cultural consciousness over time. There's kind of a famous argument by Pierre Bourdieu in the 20th century that literary fiction and the field of literary production can be split into kind of high art and low art. And low art is genre fiction. It's ultimately it's manufactured for profit, and it's manufactured for the consumer's pleasure. While high art is manufactured more for artistic merit, it's for symbolic and cultural capital, and often that comes at the cost of economic success. So that's another reason we kind of chose to look at Norton Anthology, because this is featuring literary fiction. This is featuring fiction that has been canonized, has been kind of named prestigious and named as high. And the reason we want to do that is because this helps us kind of problematize that binary, because we're actually looking at how books that have this high art, a commodity nature, actually function in the real world as commodities. Because there's no escaping it. In the end, these books are consumer objects. People pay for them. People check them out. These are economic transactions that are happening. So we have our authors from the Norton Anthology. And so the main methodology that consists of, this is the group of 5 over a couple of weeks during the summer. We found all the different author variations for the authors we were interested in the data. This is a lot of manual looking, a lot of different kind of filtering to seeing what are the different unique author names associated with, for example, Tim Morrison. And then once we had all the author names and we had all their associated books, then we went through and made sure to cluster similar titles together in order to kind of understand how this unique works are moving together. So that's one of the big contributions that we made over the summer, is this large data set of 93 authors, 1,600 works, and their associated checkouts over time. And what we do present to you guys at the end, there'll be a QR code on the screen, an interactive tool for anyone who wants to go look through any of these authors and their works, how this kind of move over time, and the different time series that we have from the Seattle Public Library as a result of them. Okay, let's hop into some results. What is being checked out? Here I've got a bar graph of the major authors, the most popular authors in our data set and total checkouts. It's a lot of genre fiction authors. We've got Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, N.K. Jemisin, Kurt Vonnegut, Philip K. Dick. Um, this is dystopian literature, speculative fiction, science fiction. It's also a lot of women authors, which is kind of surprising given that the Norton Anthology is over 70% male in terms of what it is. So there's a lot of disproportionate kind of effects going on here. Um, Four authors from this list actually come from one section in the entire Norton Anthology. This is actually a new section to the Norton Anthology just recently, which is specifically targeted at science fiction. Philip K. Dick, Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, N.K. Jemisin. Those represent 4% of the authors we looked at. In terms of checkout share, though, those are 25% of all the checkouts in our data set are from those four authors. This is, I think, shows two things. One, it shows the serious efforts recently of editors of the Norton Anthology to kind of integrate more popular fiction into what's getting canonized. And two, it also shows the prestigious status of science fiction specifically compared to other genres, right? We don't see romance, we don't see fantasy, we don't see crime fiction up here. This is science fiction that has this kind of privileged position as being both popular fiction in the genre fiction system, while also getting literary prestige at the same time. So what are the books that are getting checked out? It's a lot of the same story. A lot of speculative fiction, Parable of the Sower, The Sympathizer, which is more of a spy novel, Kindred, The Left Hand of Darkness. I think one interesting example here is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, because it demonstrates some of the problems with using the Seattle Public Library checkout data as a proxy for larger book sales. The popularity of the book is largely driven by a spike in 2024, up to 4,000 checkouts per month. And that's largely because of the Seattle Reads program, which is kind of like the Seattle Public Library's book club initiative, where they chose that book for the year. And thus, a lot of people read it in the Seattle Public Library. So this is like an example of where you can go wrong with this type of data analysis when we're using the Seattle Public Library local library system checkout data as a proxy for larger sales trends. We have to really pay attention to stuff like library programming, because that's going to affect the dynamics of any local branch. So those are kind of the major books we looked at. I also want to look at a bit when and why books get checked out. A lot of these books that we're looking at are books that have been around now for a long time, since 1945. Yet we're looking at checkouts over the recent 20 years, which is kind of the time frame we have for the Seattle Public Library, 2005 to 2025. So what's kind of causing these spikes in these books, sometimes 40, 50 years after they release? These are questions that we had. And I want to highlight two approaches. Oh, I thought I moved the slide. I want to highlight kind of two approaches that might make sense for thinking about this type of thing. Why and when are books read? In prior work, economists have worked with book sales data that they've gotten access to and done econometric modeling on it, right? So these are regression analyses that are attempting to decompose book sales for large amounts of books into key variables. This is really powerful and kind of the gold standard. They have like decay models where they build after release dates, and they add in variables like Oprah's book club and beat on the New York Times bestseller list as ways to understand the different shapes of the way book sales decay over time. This is really strong. It allows us to kind of quantify the impact of these different levers on what's going to happen. Other approaches, on the left here, I've got a figure from Carl Berglund's paper on audiobooks and the idea of an author's backlist. And the point he's making in this graph, each of these peaks comes at a release of the author on the screen's new book. And their entire backlist benefits. The entire backlist gets more streams every time the author releases a book. Importantly, he's not modeling anything here. He's just throwing up a visual, and he's using common sense to make a causal claim, right? There's nothing in the method that lends itself to causality. There's no quantitative estimate of the effect that's happening. But instead of creating a data source, a data stream to generate releases by authors on backlisted titles across a large sample size, he's able to pretty effectively get at a conclusion with just his method of exploratory data analysis. So I think it's important kind of difference to highlight. The work we do in this paper is largely exploratory data analysis. We're looking at curves of specific books. We're looking at external stimuli that are hard to model in scalable data streams. It's hard to pull in. It's hard to generalize. That makes it hard to do econometric modeling, and as a result, we don't have the ability to kind of quantify the amount these external stimuli are actually going to have on our dependent variable. We can mostly just point to directionality and use kind of our common sense and humanistic reasoning to make arguments about why we think this matters. So let's hop into some of the external stimuli we actually looked at. Unsurprisingly, we looked at Hollywood movie adaptations. On the y-axis, we have the total number of checkouts. On the x-axis, we have checkout date. We identified prominent movie adaptations from all the kind of authors in the Norton Anthology. And we graphed their release dates in both theaters and streaming with the dotted lines. Every single one of our movie adaptations that we identified corresponds with at least a short-term spike in checkouts. I'm going to point specifically to the White Noise example by the book by Don DeLillo. The Greta Gerwig adaptation comes out in 2023, I think. And then the book goes from getting checked out under 15 times a month throughout its entire time frame up to over 150 for about 2 months, 3 months, before decaying right back down to its original value. That's kind of the trend we see across all of these, is that major Hollywood adaptations lead to short-term spikes before decay to the mean for a lot of these adaptations. This is kind of similar with TV adaptations. So TV adaptations, here I've got Octavia Butler's Kindred, Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, and Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer. And I think it's pretty clear in the first two, the kind of impact of the TV show. The Man in the High Castle is really striking. It was elevated long runtime for the show, multi-season, and there were elevated checkouts kind of throughout the period. We don't really see the same effect in The Sympathizer. And there's a couple of reasons for that. We think that's because Sympathizer was already put on a lot of best of the decade lists in 2020. It received the Pulitzer Prize in 2016. It already was like a major book in the media and in national attention. The TV show was unlikely to bring new readers to the book. But in the end, these are kind of hypotheses. The way scholars have talked about the impact of media adaptations in the past and on books and on book sales is through the exposure of people who don't read to an IP, right? So perhaps that wasn't really happening with something like The Sympathizer. Another kind of major external stimuli that we looked at was authors dying. We looked at the 8 authors from the Norton Anthology who actually died during our time frame, and we looked at the checkouts of all their works. Once again, almost every single one of them post-death received a major short-term boost in their checkouts before decaying back to their standard levels. It's really unfortunate. I presume they'd be getting royalties from all these books, assuming that these massive the book sales a bit, and they won't be able to enjoy it, unfortunately. I think one example I want to point out here is David Foster Wallace here in the top left. David Foster Wallace committed suicide in 2008, and his checkouts don't recede back to normal after his death. Instead, his suicide has been talked about as kind of propelling his cultural legacy and helping form him as part of the cultural consciousness, right? So after his death, his checkouts move up from 25 to over 125. It's a major step change, and they stay there. So that's an example of a kind of different thing happening. This isn't just like a short-term kind of boost to the sales. It's a unique case what's happening with him. So another example of the types of external stimuli that shape books and authors' checkouts over time in a way that demonstrates how these objects are functioning in a market ecosystem. And then the final example we wanted to look at, we looked at scandal. Both Junot Diaz and Sherman Alexie were accused of sexual discriminatory towards women in 2018. And there's a lot of research about whether publicity, bad publicity, leads to kind of commercial consequences for bad actors. There were professional consequences for these allegations. They were stripped of awards, stripped of faculty appointments, et cetera. There's less evidence that there was any kind of commercial backlash as a result of it. One thing I point out here is that both these kind of spikes that we identify are also coincide with the release of new novels for both of them. And I mentioned earlier how the Carl Berglund plot showed how authors' new releases often impact their backlist, their backlog of books. So these are confounders, and with our methods, where we're mostly just kind of looking at graphs and talking about them, we can't really disentangle the impact of this. This is also a sample size of 2, right? So this isn't anything we don't have much conclusive to say. Even when we remove their new releases from the graphs in the checkouts, we still kind of see that the spikes there. But once again, this is confounded by possible synergistic effects of new releases on backlog books. So that's all we got. The work that we've done here has been published in the Anthology of Computers and the Humanities. The QR code on the other side of the screen is a link to an interactive tool that we published that lets you mess around with our data and the Seattle Public Library checkouts. You can see how these kind of canonized titles, these famous titles, are moving over time in Seattle circulation. And we think there's like a lot of possible future research that we can do with this. There's tons of different other types of stimuli we'd be interested in looking at. We're interested in eventually making models of how these books are functioning with hopefully more scalable data streams and more independent variables than just release date and presence on a bestseller list and presence in a few major variables. We'd like to incorporate some of these more kind of discrete book-specific events into building these models to kind of get the sense of how these books are actually functioning as commodities. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yeah.